So, before we begin to look at what we have done and the consequences of what we have done, I think it is necessary that we spend some time examining very simply and at a very shallow level a concept that we know as growth. Now, when we think of growth, we normally think of something that is increasing. And this is in fact what growth means at its most basic level. But there is also another kind of growth which we think of as maturity. And most of us are familiar with these two types of growth. But there is also a third kind of growth, which is not widely recognized as growth as yet. And that third kind of growth is what we call synthesis. Now, if we look at the first kind of growth, what we have in this kind of growth is usually an increase in the number of things. The second kind of growth involves an organism growing to maturity. There is no increase of things as such in this growth to maturity, but there is a change in the way that the organism functions. And when we come to the third type of growth, which I said is synthesis, we know very little about it. And all I can tell you is that this growth comes about through an increase in information and the processing of information and the linking together of several different independent systems, and the generation through this linking together of these several different independent systems of what can be called a network and what is sometimes called a web, and the output of which is quite different from the input that these various systems bring to it. It is a complex interaction because at times not all of those systems which are linked up may be engaged in making inputs or engaged in processing the outputs. But what we do know is that the output of this web or this network is more than the sum of the inputs of the various systems that generate the network by linking up together. So there's not too much that we know about this third type of growth, but we do know that it is going to be important and that it is likely to play a significant role in our attempts to perceive potential pathways to the future. Now, to get back to the first type of growth, which is just an increase of things, one of its characteristics is that it requires resources in order for these things to increase. And its ability to increase is therefore limited by the amount of resources that it has access to at any given moment of time. So if we do not have resources, that kind of growth tends to slow down and come to a halt. When we look at the second type of growth, which is maturity, it also requires resources, but it requires resources at different levels, different quantities, and different rates. So it begins at a certain level, it reaches a certain level, and then it more or less stabilizes at that level. And that is normally the level that we call maturity. And having reached maturity, it functions at that level for a while, and then it begins to degenerate and it collapses. Now, if you look at the first type of growth, let us assume that there is enough of resources and this growth proceeds. If you look at a collection of things, you can keep adding to those things as long as you can make more things. And the things may pile up, or they may be strewn around the place, but that does not interfere in the process of your making more and more of those things. But if you look at this process of maturity, this state that it reaches, which we call maturity, cannot be sustained indefinitely. It can be sustained only as long as there is a thing which we can call integrity that is present. In the case of the first kind of growth that we saw, increase, we saw that the primary problem there is availability or access to resources. If there are no resources, you cannot have the growth and you will have a collapse. We saw that in the case of maturity, we needed integrity. If the integrity is gone or the integrity begins to be lost, you have a collapse. And the problem we see with synthesis is that as the synthesis increases, we run into a problem of communication. The output of the synthesis becomes increasingly difficult to communicate. We have to string together concepts. We have to create hybridized concepts. And we have to use words in ways that they were not originally intended to be used. So there is a danger when you try to communicate a synthesis. And the danger is that your audience may fail to understand what is being communicated. And this raises the very interesting question as to whether in such a situation, whether this web or network is going to collapse, or whether something else is going to collapse, leaving this network to take its place and move forward. neither the network nor the web has received any kind of formal recognition. What I mean is, you cannot register a network or a web as a network or a web in any legal system, as far as I am aware. And I take it that this indicates very clearly that we do not know what to do with these networks, and we do not know what to do with webs. They seem to have a life of their own. They do have dynamics, and they are going somewhere, and we are not very clear about where they are going, and we are not quite sure whether we can determine where they should go and what they should do and what they shouldn't do and where they shouldn't go. And it is not even very clear as to whether we can exercise that kind of control over them. And there is even room to suspect or room to look very carefully at whether in fact they are exercising some kind of control, or whether they are having some other impact on us in a way that is making us think differently and behave differently. And if that is indeed the case, then it would be very interesting to know whether that impact is going to be of some use to us in this task that we are engaged in, this task of trying to perceive pathways to potential futures. So what you could actually do, and what I think you should do before we go any deeper into this subject, is to think about growth. Because as we go forward, you will begin to realize, as we have, that this growth is not necessarily something that we chose to do, but it is something that we have done. We have grown. And in the process of this growth, this increase, we have consumed lots of resources. And in fact, the resources that we have used for growth so far are now becoming increasingly difficult to find. So we may not be able to continue with this growth for much longer, maybe a few decades or at the most a century. And so within that time, we have to understand growth. We have to understand what growth can be used for. We have to understand what we have used growth for so far. And we have also got to understand what we can use growth for in the future. And we have to learn to use growth in this kind of way. And it is probably going to be a very, very interesting learning experience, provided we enter this learning experience with open minds and do not try to impose anything on whatever we encounter. I think if we go forward with that kind of an open mind and that kind of an open attitude, there is a very good chance that we may learn quite a lot more than what we have already learned. And we may be able to generate a relationship with our environment that is quite different from the one that we have been accustomed to over the last at least 200 or 300 years, maybe many more years. And by doing this, we may actually be able to generate a future that is something that we would be happy to have contributed towards. Thank you.